Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering the Immortal Great Souls series, the Rascor Plains, chapters 44 through 47. In these chapters, Scorio's prison becomes his crucible. He's in a crucible. Right inside a crucible, kind of. Scorio, I'm proud of you, buddy. I really am. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Dan for commissioning this episode. So, guys, remember how 2 episodes when we are talking about Scorio's, back-breaking labor, how I said that it's a really fine line as a writer to figure out how to make something feel as grueling as you need them to understand it was, without also making the reader feel like reading about it is a chore. And it's so fascinating to me because basically this author has decided to put himself through this challenge twice. It's just incredibly different scenarios. They are essentially polar opposites of each other. One of them is perfecting his physical body by incredibly strenuous labor, and there can be basically no real thought involved because you think too long about what you're doing and it'll just make you go bonkers. And the other is physical activity is simply impossible. You cannot physically move, and only mental exercises are what possible and what are going to help you through the I don't even know what to call this. Challenge is inadequate. It's a trial, I suppose, is really the word I want here. It's sort of funny because I had considered that maybe something regarding the secret marinating technique was going to end up being a factor with this imprisonment. And I almost mentioned it last episode and I forgot to bring it up. And to be honest, I didn't recall enough about it to feel like I could formulate any sort of hypothesis on that anyway. So I was delighted that there is an aspect of that, but that it also is distinctly a different process. It's given him the idea upon which to base the practice that he winds up coming up with. And so it was crucial, but it isn't actually oh, I learned this thing and I can just do it now, which I feel like another author may have done. Something really one-to-one where, I've been taught this thing and now I have the answer already. Really what Scorio has is an answer, and he has to sort of reverse engineer the way to make it apply to the current situation he's in. And that is a lot more interesting to read. It's a lot more satisfying as well because it feels like he has really taught himself, he has created an answer to the problem on his own versus what it could very easily feel like is he got given the answer by somebody earlier in the book or in the series. And I have come across that sort of, they were given the answer. I'm not trying to say that can never work, but it often feels a little bit too much like one of those old folk tales, where if you give a lady a piece of bread who's begging on the street, she'll be like, "Oh, you kind girl, here's a mirror." And then the mirror winds up saving her life later, and you're just kind of like, I guess that was pretty easy. And instead here we've got like just a he's given the start of the answer to the problem, but he still has to work it out himself, which is ideal because all he can do is think, right? Down here, this is a section in which I genuinely began to believe that Scorio was losing it a little bit. That's also difficult to pull off because, you know, a character like Scorio that is very much our main, we jump into our little sort of interstitials here and there where we've got an interlude with people whose POVs we're not normally in. He is our guy, though. And you know, intellectually, that he is going to be okay. He's going to come out of it. But I did start to be like, oh, your boy might be kind of damaged, though. You know, like, I don't know how he still will likely be. I'll be very interested to see, actually, if this materially becomes some sort of phobia for him. He is essentially locked in place in like a coffin, and the idea that he would develop claustrophobia or something is not unrealistic after a situation like this. Especially claustrophobia, a big part of that is feeling stuck. And even if he weren't in a coffin, period, he is unable to move in the most basic senses. So that, even if he were like in open air but unable to move in that way, might still result in a feeling of claustrophobia a lot of the time. And I don't know. I can't decide like whether I want to see that or not, because there are times where watching somebody cope with the trauma of things that have happened earlier in the book, there are times when that's really interesting to see. And then there are times where it can kind of feel like just something that keeps being popped in to sort of add tension and feels more frustrating than anything. And I have like a very varying response to it. There's another book that I covered, and I'm still in the midst of the series, but there hasn't been an episode commissioned in a minute, so it may die out. But the character is kept in a coffin essentially for a year. And I expected him to be dealing with a lot of trauma due to that. And it seems like he sort of just shakes it off, which I found to be a bit of a bummer. Scorio, this is not a full year, but it is enough time that I don't... this sort of thing can... like, trauma can develop whether or not you've been in there, like, 5 minutes. It's all about the emotion that you're experiencing, not necessarily the length of time. So, anyway, as I'm usually doing, I get ahead of myself. Chapter 44. He falls asleep, wakes up, falls asleep. There is this mention that his body never ached, never grew restless, never itched and yearned to stretch. It became easy to detach from it. And that I found really interesting, because part of the idea of not being able to move is wanting to, for, like, granted, you want to escape from this, right? But that's a different thing than the feeling of, like, I am cramped. I have been kept in this one position. My muscles are beginning to hurt, and I would like to vary my position to stretch, and I can't do that. He isn't experiencing that, which is really something that I would feel like would be a big contributor to a trauma like claustrophobia. So perhaps the fact that he isn't actually really in any sort of pain might help keep that from being too dramatic for him, but I don't know. Dan says Scorio has an interesting way of dealing with trauma. That is true. So he's continuing to think through what could have happened here. House Kraken's play on the docks made no sense. Even if they seized the mana, they'd only incur the wrath of the Iron Tyrant and the other houses. The Hydra ship, it had been docked innocently down the way. When the fight broke out, it had begun to disgorge a serious number of great souls who'd rushed eagerly into battle without hesitation or surprise, who'd been waiting on a ship with no activity taking place before it. No loading, no cargo, nothing. Just waiting. House Hydra. Praximar. So this was my suspicion, but I couldn't figure out exactly what Praximar's link with this could be. And the conclusion that Scorio comes to, because the way that these heart oaths work, I was thinking the fact that this went into motion before his heart oath would make it so that it was like getting around the clause, that it would be a loophole. But it seems like things are much more about the spirit of it rather than the letter of it. So he actually can't get around it that way. What he has to do is trust somebody else to put things in motion. And yes, he will benefit from it. And yes, he will know something is on the horizon, but he isn't actually personally responsible for the plan, and he isn't involved directly. And so that is a really interesting, it's still kind of a loophole, but it's not as simple a loophole as I was expecting. And then the fact that, Praximar, he's does he really hate me so much that he would set this up to just fuck with me? And Scorio comes to the conclusion that, I don't think this whole thing was about me. I think I wound up being a convenient person, and it was a sort of two birds, that this I was definitely not necessarily going to be the target initially. Not that he wasn't going to be the one set up to do this, because it seems like the plan had been in motion, and then Scorio wound up walking into a scenario where he could be the one to carry off the plan. I'm trying to find the spot here. A completely unsuspecting house. Octavia would be ambushed. House Kraken would fall to the sudden attack. By the time the Iron Tyrant's forces arrived, the battle might already be over. And then House Kraken would be blamed. Hydra, perhaps, censured for being over-enthusiastic. Basilisk wasn't a serious contender for political power. Chimera was outwardly focused. Praximar would effectively take control of the council and the shoals. Of course. And he recalled the first time they'd met Druana. Her opening query, "You're quite the group. Where are you headed? Are you on Basilisk business?" Which immediately led to another memory. Nissa. "We can help you get in touch with Manticore if you like." What if Praximor had received word from Moira and tasked Basilisk with putting a plan in motion, one whose details he didn't know? And the idea that Nissa was part of this makes a lot of sense. I was expecting that the way she was talking meant that something was going to occur before they left the city. And this saying they want to thank you before you go. You guys know. I thought that was double speak, pretty much. And it turns out that was correct. What she was projecting her anxiety about was a completely different thing, actually. And he also comes to the conclusion that I did about the smashing rocks was supposed to have been something that would make him bail, and then they could set him up using the fact that he clearly looked like he was going to quit. And the concept of whether or not this actually caused desaturation, he's questioning as well. Based on the way things shake out in these chapters, I think that was true. And maybe it was, Scorio's earlier theory about the fact that, we weren't taught this is because this is not information that anybody in the academy would need to know, because they would never be they would never be tempered in cold to begin with. So I think maybe he was right. We are very reasonably suspicious, but the fact that it seems like his body has been tempered again, I think that must have been true. And his friends Naomi, Leonci, and Leonis, they'd never believed Scorio would do this on purpose, because from the outside it looked bad, real bad. Everyone had seen him take the cup on board. He'd been the only one who knew the sequence. But his friends would never believe he was in on the plan with House Kraken. And like that, a host of new realizations broke open. And he remembers Idriel talking about his interest, like House Kraken's interest in you. The Pyre Lady asked for you by name. All of this said in front of everybody. Now, I really, really hope that his friends don't believe this of him. I wouldn't blame Juniper and Zala. Of course, it's like at the moment, I think that Jova will fall for it. I believe eventually something is going to happen to make her realize that she's been played. But I think initially she may fall for it because she's already predisposed to feel like she is better than him. But if Leonis and Leonci, I'm not even counting Naomi because I find it a given that she will not believe that he did this. But if Leonis and Leonci get fooled into believing that this is true, I'm going to be upset about it. It had better be a really, really convincing explanation. You know, there has to be like something on their end that got also set up in addition to the way everything else looked, because otherwise I just don't know, kids. This is the sort of thing that when it's done badly, I find absolutely excruciating. When it's done well, it's excruciating, but in a way that's like, you earned that shit, you know? So the whole, there's been a terrible misunderstanding or somebody has been set up. There are a lot of times where that will pop up in a story and I will feel utter rage at the fact that these people are allegedly somebody's friends and they are very quick to believe something low-key unforgivable that their friend did. You know what I'm saying? So I don't want it to be just what we have seen so far that makes them believe he is guilty. I am going to want some sort of additional something that you tack that on and you're kind of like, oh God, yeah, okay, all together. Like, you know, if this were a different type of story, for example, they could fake emails between him and Hydra, or texts, or they could make fake like security footage or set him up to be somewhere. All of that would be, in addition to what we've got so far, enough that I would be like, yeah, okay, eventually you reach a point where how can you keep denying it without looking like you're just super paranoid? But if we're just going with what we've got so far, I feel like the way that this could be a setup is pretty transparent if you have any faith in him. So I'm just really hoping that if they do lose faith in Scorio, it feels like that has been set up really, 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 really well. Like I said, Juniper and Zala, whatever. They don't know him that well yet. It's early days in their relationship. They've been separated pretty much because of the way he's been working. They have not gotten to know him all that well. And if they don't believe the best of him, I don't blame them. But his closest friends, Dan says, you are going to be so mad, but not for the reasons you think. I think that's a good sign, right? But yeah, you guys, anybody who has listened to this show for a long time knows that I have a few things that are like particular pet peeves, and this series has not done them. So I'm willing to like have faith in the author here. But one of the things is I'm going to throw in a romance because I need these two people to like create drama that isn't real so that I have something to write about. We need them to be jealous, or we need them to have something that they're so afraid to lose all of a sudden that they'll risk anything and do anything. And that kind of shit is so cheap and lazy, especially if the characters don't feel like they even have real chemistry on the page. And the other one is the misunderstanding. I misheard something, or I was eavesdropping and out of context it sounded like blank, blank, blank. I fucking hate that shit. So, like I said, I'm having faith here, but y'all can imagine the way that things went down with like House of the Dragon at the end of season 1. That's part of why that show really kind of lost its way for me, was everybody's actions. Nobody just did things because they were kind of selfish and bad and wanted to do shitty things. They did it because they just failed to understand what was really going on, because there was a misunderstanding. I have no patience for it. I just don't. And it's like, it's so profoundly lazy, and it's also really demonstrates to me that like you are relying on your characters being very foolish, which isn't a good look. That's also lazy, and it's also kind of insulting to your reader. I don't like the feeling that I am way smarter than the main character. I don't enjoy that feeling. That's something that like I know some folks look for, especially in mysteries, is like if somebody... There are two different types of mystery writers, and one of them is the one where it's like the audience likes to figure it out with me, and I like to give them the clues, and they start to piece it. And then there are mystery writers who are like, I don't want you to figure this out, and I'm not going to give you all the information explicitly so that you cannot figure it all out. And I would much prefer, with almost anything, to feel like the main character is a step ahead of me. It's just that doesn't always have to be the case. As with anything I say that I prefer, there are always going to be exceptions to everything. But for the most part, if I feel like I'm much smarter than the main, it can be very tedious to wait for them to finally figure out the thing that I have already figured out. Now, this is different than you get some information that the main doesn't have, and you're watching your poor main stumble around without that info, knowing, oh, sweetie, you don't even realize. Like, that's a different thing, where you have been instilled now with a sense of dread because you are aware they're walking into a trap. That's a separate issue. Anyway, I know I'm talking in lots of hypotheticals, but there is so much of these chapters that is like just basically him losing his fucking mind that I feel like I can kind of... I can indulge myself a little bit on some of this talk, you know what I'm saying? So, and there's this point, you guys, I felt so bad here. What a fool he'd been. What a credulous idiot. Oh, sweetie, I'm so sorry. A credulous idiot. That is so harsh. And I don't think he's wrong, but that's rough, man. They must have thought him the most trusting of cat's paws. And there he'd been, taking satisfaction in his own masochism, taking a perverse pride in his willingness to do whatever was needed to achieve what people told him was his next goal, shattering rocks while they'd orchestrated his downfall. They must have crowed in delight over how easily he was manipulated. And what had he thought about all that time? Whether Jova was truly upset with him, how long it would take to get to meditate, how could he best convince Damien to reward him with rich mana for his self-sacrifice? You guys, I'm just going to say now, if it turns out this is all being set up for Scorio to think that Manticore was in on it, and he wasn't, they weren't, and he's wrong, that's going to be a real, that's going to fuck me up. Because it feels so clear right now. And I can't imagine what it... The only reason to set it up to make it look like Manticore planned this and was out to get him, is because you think you know Scorio is going to get out of this somehow. What good does it do if you put Scorio in this box to die, knowing that this, or so, I'm putting knowing in quotation marks, knowing Manticore set him up, and he does die? That's the only thing that's kind of keeping me from thinking that's what happened, is like, whoever put him in this box and put him down, and we know who put him, but you know what I'm saying, the bigger whoever. If that person really believed Scorio was going to manage to find a way out, I don't even know what to say. I don't like, part of me is like, that would be amazing. And another part of me is like, would I hate it? I can't decide. I genuinely can't decide. So I'm going to go with Occam's razor here and just assume that Manticore is not to be trusted, that the reason that everybody was so fucking weird with them is because they knew that these people weren't going to be around, that he was being set up. I'm going to take it at face value. There is like a tiny part of me that is sort of like, but what if it's not, though? Like, I can't help it. I can't help it. Okay. So, he tries to transform in this prism, and it is enough that he is filled with such self-loathing after he realizes this, that he begins to want to hurt himself. So the transformation begins to hurt, and he is kind of like, yeah, this is what I fucking deserve. And as he's like paused in the midst of it, when his horns begin to cave his head in from the pressure against this thing, and he almost is like, maybe I fucking just should. Maybe I should. And he can't do it. His skull had distended under the pressure, nearly cracked. Yes, he thought, give me that pain. He lost himself in it for a while, but it didn't last. Couldn't last. Hours or days later, it finally faded away, leaving him there, upside down and staring into golden death. So, I don't know how much to trust what his, like, assumption of the time passing is. Like, I feel at the end of this group of chapters that he thinks it has been weeks, right? At least. And I really can't tell if that is accurate or not, if I should trust him on that or not. I'm going to be so curious to find out just how much time went by. For ages, Scorio wandered amongst his delirious memories. He felt no hunger, no need to void his bowels, no discomfort. His body faded away altogether, leaving him in an unending nightmare of mishmash dreams and recollections. And he's thinking back on all of the different people from Manticore that he talked to. And Damien saying, you'll get as much mana as you need to advance, and Scorio being like, oh, I guess he fucking didn't lie about that, which I had meant to mention last episode, that's one of the last things Damien says to him, and like, oh shit, that's fucked up. Fury gave way to remorse, guilt became regret, and then brash hatred. He vowed revenge 1,000 times over, and only felt all the more pathetic for it. Cursed himself, cursed Damien, Nissa, all of them, and always he came back to the solitude of his mind. What if this coffin lasted for years? He'd go mad. He knew it with cold certainty. The next time jaws closed around his coffin, he ignited and hit the beast with his aura. Take me to the surface, he roared at it with all his being. And he does indeed get brought to the surface. It seems like this one use of it, like it's all the copper he's got left, manages to get him up there. And it's, at first, he's like tumbling through the air and he's sinking back into the gold and he's like, fuck. And then he gets stuck and he's in the shallows. And this is just this like giddy moment of being somewhere new and getting to see different things, and is like, this is a treat. Actually, it feels like, as he can't move, nothing else has really changed, but at least he is able to see things. And he's realizing that the creature's markings change in intensity of color based on how much they're feeding. Slowly, the sight of the torpid lizards in the cavern wall grew stale. He watched them dive 100, 1,000 times, saw them occasionally squabble, snap at each other, retreat into the caves, then emerge. They were enormously dull, and he began to loathe them. This is something that I think is really funny, is the idea that, like, it's not the thing's fault, but just the fact that you're stuck staring at it every day for, all of this time, that it becomes something that you hate and despise, even though your hatred really doesn't have anything to do with the thing itself. This is a very real phenomenon, Voices from his past rose and fell, melded with each other, mocked him, insulted him, and he welcomed their every castigation, deserved it. Just before he lost his mind altogether, a vision came to him. A pile of rocks, huge boulders embedded in clay, all of it covered in ferns and moss, the size of a house, some of the rocks as large as a cart. And this is the pile that he is meant to have broken down. So what he decides he's going to do is imagine the process that he went through with breaking this down with Naomi in minute detail, including their fuck-ups. And that is going to occupy his mind, is imagining that he is back here, which is honestly hilarious. Like, just the idea that after going through this, when he's on the edge of madness, thinking about that is what keeps him in his right mind. That's wild shit. And it makes total sense because, again, this is the exact opposite of the situation he had been in. He was in a purely physical challenge. And now he is in a purely mental challenge. So imagining something that is hyper-physical is going to be comforting. It's going to feel like a little bit of a release somehow, That actually totally checks out. It's just funny. It's something that when you step back and really look at it, you're just like, God, irony. So the pile falls apart, and the Saurians napped on their ledges. Gold mana burned. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional bubble of magma popping. Scorio mentally inhaled, held his mind as still as possible, a great and trembling expanse of frozen glass. Then, when he could hold it no more, his mind shattered, and he screamed. And his brain just goes kind of dark for a bit. Wind whistled through it occasionally, but no words, no thoughts, barely any emotion. Then one day, something new. He'd never seen this fiend before. It was many times larger than the others. So, this thing grabs him up and tries to chew him. And Scorio at this point is, yeah, please do it. Please fucking kill me. Eat me. Get it over with. I am over this. And it's like this fucking coffin that he is in is so strong. This fiend's teeth can only just about crack it. That's the best it can do. Which, honestly, I just want to take a moment to say how remarkable that is. How strong the power of the people he has been surrounded by actually is. is something that I think I kind of lose track of occasionally. And just this has been a while now that he has been locked in this thing. And it is still so strong that it can withstand that kind of like, that's bananas. And it does. So like, yeah, he's like, I'm hoping it'll eat me, but it doesn't. It cracks it. And then it gives up, slides away. And he's looking at the hole in it. And he's just like, what is this? There's gold coming in. Oh God, I guess the gold will kill me. And maybe that's something. And I can just die. And this will be a different way for it to work out. And it says this was death at last, and Idriel's plan for eternal torment had been foiled. The behemoth had saved him. It truly had proven to be his boon companion, his favorite friend. And when he said favorite friend, I was like, all right, come on, let's get this marinating technique on the road here, because something is about to happen with that. And then, yes, Nox comes to mind. That had been sapphire, which was more potent than gold, but that had been an imperial gel bath created specifically for that purpose. It had protected him, structuring the mana along its matrix. This coffin was ordered, crystalline. Scorio's thoughts came together for the first time in what felt like centuries. The gold mana would break through to him at a single spot first, but the pressure behind it would inject the gold straight into his being. His heart would seek to absorb it, only to shatter and burn. The marinating technique involved igniting the mana while pouring the rest into his reservoir, condensing it, making it as hard as a diamond, even as it had forced his reservoir to expand to its greatest size. And even then, he'd only survived due to the gel's active aid and the finite amount of sapphire. There was no end to the gold. If he split the stream, he'd ignite and fill his heart, compacting the gold in his reservoir without the gel's ameliorating effect. It would expand his reservoir till it ruptured. Then his heart would shatter and he'd die, if he could even control it without the gel's help. So he sits on this for a bit, trying to figure out how this could possibly work, and is remembering Idriel managing to split the mana up. What into what? There were no compression tanks, and then he realizes all of these fucking lizards. Boom. I can send it into them. So what he does, and this is really interesting. So the gold throughout all of this is like, you know, poking its way through, slowly boring in. What I kept imagining here, there is a sleep story on Calm, the app. If you use that, there is a, I think Camping Inside a Glacier is the name of the story. Sleep stories are meant to be sort of just, you know, relaxing tales of like low-key sorts of adventures and stuff to sort of make your mind calm down enough so that you can fall asleep as their voice gets softer and softer towards the end of the story. And one of them is this woman who goes on all of these different, she's an actual modern day explorer, and she has a story that she went on a camping trip and climbed into a glacier that's got all of these meltwater channels inside, and they are big enough to like walk in and climb through, and she sets up camp inside it and sleeps in there overnight. And it's like very cozy because it's out of the snow and out of the wind and everything. And I kept thinking about that this is like he's trapped inside a glacier and there's this meltwater channel beginning to bore its way through, made out of gold mana. So it finally gets through and it blasts into his core. He shaped and sculpted that line of fire and guided it into his heart instead of letting it cut him apart. There was no time to hesitate. He ignited, and his heart nearly burst apart. It pulsed like a living organ, coruscating golden light shafting forth from every crack, every fissure, every pitted hole. The inside began to melt, and more gold kept coming. Scorio vibrated within the coffin's confines, and the pinhole is beginning to open and open. And I love this. There is a moment where he's like, good, I'm going to die. But he just can't quite be okay with it. You know, it's like the sort of thing that when it's a hypothetical, you're like, oh yeah, definitely. I'd rather die. Fuck this. And then when you're in the actual situation, it's suddenly like, you know, there's a little thought in one of the Tyrion chapters that he thinks about how, like, everybody says they'd rather die than be a slave. But if that were true, there wouldn't be slaves. Because we all think that sounds really like I'd rather die. Would you actually, though? And he finally summons some of these lizards to him. He uses the fact that there is a hole to release his power, summon some of these things toward him. And as he begins to, like, pour the gold back out that has been purified, which is basically the finest of caviars to these creatures, they can't gather around and are like, nice, yes, please, gimme. They continue eating and are so, they absorb so much of it that they kind of get to a point where they are, I don't even know the word for it. They're just so suffused that eventually they explode. And I've got to say that even though these are fiends, this bummed me out. I'm going to be real. I am not mad at him for it. Scorio is doing what he needs to do. I don't even think that this is like a terribly cruel thing. It seems like these creatures are basically very happy right up until the moment they die. So, you know, it could be worse. But I did feel very sad because they seem mostly harmless. Like they're just hanging around, drinking some fucking gold mana and enjoying their day. And now we have this guy coming in just like ruining their shit. So the way that this like goes on and eventually there comes a moment where he is just surrounded by their bodies. I was just like, oh, these poor things. Come on, man. They're just trying to live. But the gold fell towards his heart, passed through it, passed back out, but Scorio required less and less effort to make it do so. Only then did he relax enough to appreciate the pain that came from even touching gold in the first place. He felt as if his very soul were splitting, the flesh suit of his body about to be torn asunder by terrible pressures from within. The fabric of his being was fraying. His heart was a mass of charred slivers held together by his will alone. Golden flames raged about it, spiraling up like an inferno, dozens of yards in height. Some hours later, the Saurian burst. So he summons another one. And then he realized he could summon his shroud. And he tells the creature to attack him using his ability. And the shroud is what he's pouring his own mana into. And the fact that it takes so much mana to sustain is actually working in his favor. So this is just what he keeps doing. He summons them, he feeds them this gold, they absorb it, he creates his shroud, they fight him, and then they explode after they have absorbed too much. And slowly, painfully slowly, he started to become adept at using both his aura and his shroud at the same time. It took 5 times as long for the third fiend to explode as the second. It tried to break away at the last, but was stupefied by its meal and accustomed to obeying Scorio. When it burst, there were 4 more to take its place. He crafted backgrounds and names for each one, but now they were nothing more than lifelines. In the depths of his mind, Scorio began to laugh. It was a helpless, manic sound, one step short of deranged. So he keeps this going for a while. He had never dreamed that he would become a wide open channel for endless gold, but that's what he was doing now. By the time Scorio burst his 60th or so fiend, he realized his heart looked like black stone again, not burned wood. The chunks and slivers were coagulating together, reforging into a whole, and not a rough obsidian chunk as before. It was reforming into a sphere. Scorio had no idea what that meant, but he kept channeling. My theory on this is that, and this is just, this is just my little idea here, but in the Dresden Files, he talks about how he will draw a circle when he is about to do certain types of magic, and that technically you don't even actually need to draw a circle. You can do this in your mind, but that having an actual physical circle is a really handy mental tool, and that the way that the circle is drawn, while you technically don't need it to be perfect, the more perfectly formed it is, the more efficient it works. And I'm sort of wondering if maybe the heart becoming a perfect sphere is meant to indicate that he has reached this sort of peak efficiency with its capabilities. So finally there comes a point where a fiend tries to come at him through his shroud, and it cannot break it. It cracks, but this thing can't break through it. And he needed to try a bigger saurian, so he pulls another one. His heart healed up. Scorio watched the last of the fractures heal over. The moment the coffin fell apart, he'd be assailed from all sides by gold mana. His heart no longer felt any strain, but how would it handle that assault? So he begins to test himself by pouring more gold into the stream that he ignited. His heart didn't miss a beat. It burned with perfect purity, torching the mana. He cut the third stream altogether and poured it into his heart. Immediately the flames whooshed even higher, and the strain and pain racked him. He couldn't process that much gold. Even his new heart had its limits. So then, what choice did he have? Scorio again cut the third stream, but instead of pouring it directly into his heart, he allowed it to suffuse the space taken up by his body. He was ready to cut the flow the second he began to burn, but instead he felt nothing. Pleasantly warm. That made no sense. Wait. He was starting to feel something. To his surprise, it felt like being mildly inebriated. And then he realizes it's the curse, and that his judgment is being all thrown off, and is just like, oh, fuck, right, I forgot about this whole thing. And he's like, okay, so once the coffin is gone, I won't burn up, but I'll have to deal with that. What's the deal? And this is when he realizes his body is tempered in gold, that it's actually worked. You guys, I cannot help but wonder if he does manage to find his friends and, talk to Naomi, how angry she is going to be when she realizes that he has gotten to temper himself in gold. I feel like she's going to be very jealous. I mean, not that she wants this experience, of course, but come on, there's no way that you aren't a little bit jealous of that. So finally he breaks out of it, chapter 46, and he has so much disorientation due to being immobile for so long that now being able to move and everything, it just feels very, very strange. And he has to kind of ease himself into it, because it's almost making the sensation that I'm imagining here is a sort of vertigo, and he realizes I feel fucking incredible. Oh my God. And he's looking at his heart. It was smooth to the point of glossiness and burned the gold mana effortlessly. Some part of him directed the mana to burn, but after countless weeks or months or years, he no longer had time to think about it overtly. If it turns out that it's been like 2 days, I will never stop laughing. I know it hasn't. I know it has been longer. I can trust him that much. But that was all I could think here, was just like, but what if it's so much shorter than he thought? Or what if there's some Rip Van Winkle shit and it turns out it's been, 100 years and he comes back and his friends are all dead. Anyway, the Saurians are looking at him and he thinks to himself, like, he does the leave me be command. But because that's not their natural state, it's a little bit more difficult to get them to actually like chill and leave him alone. And he's looking around at a way to get out of here, because the cavern, it's not exactly like you can just climb the walls of it with these things all around. And it says the huge dull crystals descended into view slowly, taking up a yellow glow as they charged in the atmosphere, then ascending back out of view. He had to get out, but how? I sort of thought that he might grab a hold of one of those crystals and just somehow manage to grab one and just let it haul him up and out of there. But I don't know if touching one of those is like safe. And I also figure if people are going to be monitoring this whole area and they think that he already was behind an attack, seeing him clutching a giant crystal full of gold mana might not work super well for him either. So maybe also you don't want to be seen by people, like all kinds of things. So he finally finds this this series of tunnels, and there are these creatures in these tunnels, and this turns out to be, these things are so horrifying, you guys. I hated it so much. They're grubs. I really hate this. His talons skittered over his banded armor, leaving deep grooves but failing to penetrate. Cursing, Scorio renewed his attack, and 3 strikes later managed to punch a fist through the weakened defense into the insect's soft interior. And he keeps, basically, he's being put through a gauntlet here, where he is surrounded. And when I mean surrounded, I don't mean like in a 2-dimensional space. I mean from underneath him and from above as well. These things are coming at him, and all he can do is fight them. He is being put through his paces. And as soon as this started, I was like, okay, we're about to level up again. This is what is happening, because he is just not being given a moment to breathe here, basically. Then there was nothing left to kill. Scorio turned in a ragged circle. He was knee-deep in corpses. For a moment, Scorio didn't understand, but then Jova's words returned to him. To make Flame Vault, you have to heighten that reactive point till ignition becomes reflexive. Scorio allowed his heart to go dark. The flames rose once with a great whoomph, then disappeared, leaving his heart hanging in space, huge and perfect, dark and ominous. Ignite, thought Scorio, and immediately it roared into flame. Your will is bolstered by your confidence, your trust in your own strength and integrity, your faith in your ability to accomplish your goals. Jova's voice was painfully clear. He summoned his shroud. He closed his eyes and focused on his aura. In his mind's eye, his huge heart burned. He gazed into its depths, its immensely dense reservoir of gold mana, and felt a powerful and abiding sense of self-knowledge, of confidence or focus. Whatever he had lost, whatever mistakes he'd made, he no longer had any doubt. Oh, I think that was a typo here. It says he no longer, but yeah, he no longer had any doubt as to his unity of self, of purpose, of resolve. Then the pain of his limbs, the mania of the curse, and fever-bright delirium, all of it fell away and disappeared, and Scorio found himself standing on a gray slate platform whose edges arose two freestanding portals, the void beyond starless and infinite. So, third trial. I will tell you what, Dan, I thought that maybe that was where I was supposed to stop reading, and I was about to be very upset. And then I got to the end of chapter 7, and I was still very upset, so it did not help. But I was glad I got to read 47. So we go back into this memory, and essentially it's another argument between, do we work with the people who are oppressing us, or do we take a leaf out of their fucking book? And it's like an argument as old as time, you know? Did Ulm give the port terms before they hung every suspected leader of the rebellion and drove the people out into the countryside to starve? No, agreed Waverly uncomfortably, but we are not the sea barons. If we occupy the port, the king will cease his advance. He's equipped for battle in the field, not for a siege. He'll realize our forces will harry his flanks while he tries to build siege engines. This is an unrivaled opportunity to demonstrate to all in one that the king's lies about our nature are precisely that, vile slander. What are you suggesting? That we slap Ulm and Pothos on the wrist, tax them for their slaughter, and let them go? The sea barons are split, said Waverly quietly. Ulm and Pothos for the king, the ivory jester and Tigrim hewing to neutrality, and Kilm considering throwing in with us. If we release Ulm and Pothos, we can convince the whole league to join us. Puh! Scorio's own brother courted the bastards for months and got nowhere. No, we need to teach him a lesson. There are consequences, even for the wealthy. This is no game. They bloody their hands, we'll bloody their necks. How many legendaries march with them? That we're not sure. Parsifal the Green, assuredly, and Miranus, the king's scepter. Gerbane was seen with the army 2 weeks ago, which means the bear and the blind healer. There will be more. Scorio tapped his lips. The king knew I'd be leading our fleet. Cut the head from the snake and the threats ended. 4 or 5 legendaries can't take an entire port, said Waverly. But 10 could. Kurgan, for example. I split with my brother, Waverly, because I chose not to court the lords of the realm. It's a fool's game. The sea barons had ample opportunity to throw in with us before. But their situation has never been so dire. Policy changes. Word will spread. There's a second opportunity at hand. So, Scorio looks around. He sees that his guys are starting to reach a point where they want this shit to be over. A year and a half now they'd been fighting, and all things being equal, they were winning. But Scorio could sense it, the growing fatigue. Waverly was right. It would be pragmatic to force the barons into an alliance now. Sure, it would sit ill with the many who'd suffered beneath their oppression and brutality, but if they swore their ships and wealth to Scorio, it would do much to turn the tide. But the very thought made Scorio want to growl. When Ulm took Spurn Harbor, he lined the wall with bodies. The tales of the women and children starving in the countryside drove more men into our ranks than any victory of ours. The people follow me because I promise change, justice, whatever that means. You will inflame the king's supporters if you do the same. Gold, provisions, what will we spend it on? Who will carry the food to our people? Word of happens here will spread farther than the wind. Then show them the kind of ruler you mean to be. It isn't glamorous, nor does it set the heart racing, but the long game is won by careful moves. So then he says we offer to enroll soldiers who wish to defect, and these guys are like, excuse me? Absolutely fucking not. And he's like, but we need them. And Scorio was just like, I don't even know why I pretended this was a debate. Fuck them. No. The king's forces are excused every horror because they're stamping out cockroaches, while we're asked to turn the cheek and forgive every sin to prove ourselves better men. Every soldier in Spurn Harbor knew what he was doing when he agreed to fight for the barons and kill our people. Every man and woman behind those walls had ample opportunity to walk away from the atrocities they've been ordered to commit. I understand your desire for vengeance, but you cannot sink to their level. Oh, but I can. Spurn Harbor will be a warning to the kingdom, a message of righteous vengeance to our people, and an accounting to every soldier who thinks they can hide behind the king's cloak. At dawn, we'll dock just as Harkin attacks the gates. We'll force our way inside and slaughter every kingsman and mercenary we can find, and by the day's end, I want Ulm and Pothos swinging by their necks for all to see. Other barons will quit the sidelines. Every nobleman will join to move the king. It's all fun and games till you hang one of their own. It was never fun and games, said Scorio, rising. Let this finally show them. And with that thought, the world went dark, and Scorio found himself kneeling once more in the dark, surrounded by the corpses of the gold fiends. So now he is a flame vault. Just for the record, pretending to be the bigger person has worked like twice in history. And when I say pretending, I know that sounds very cynical, because I'm basically like, you aren't a bigger person, but you have to act like you are. But honestly, I mean that shit. The kinds of oppression that we have inflicted upon other human beings in history, these are not the types of things that you reason with. And these are not the types of things that a person can do to another person. It's something that a person does to another animal, and they don't see you as a person anymore. So trying to reason and behave as if you are somehow better, they don't see you as fully human anyway. So it will not work. And it's just a very frustrating thing for me, the idea that like we have to stay civil, because that has historically almost never ever worked. There's been like a couple examples, and they are such rare cases. That's why they get trotted out. And in a couple of those cases, it like worked, and yet the leader still got assassinated. So what does that tell you? Like, I do not personally believe that profound change on the levels that we're talking about in this story, or that we're dealing with in the present, in our actual world, I don't believe that these are the sorts of things that can be solved via peaceful means. I just don't. And I don't relish war, and I don't have any illusion about what that is. Like, I haven't experienced it, so I'm not trying to pretend I know. But I understand in a way that is growing more and more acute what that means. But I also understand how incredibly broken everything is, and how if it can be this bad, and people who have the power to help are still not, there's something wrong with them. We're not the problem. They're the problem. Something's wrong with them. And just comes a point where you got to start speaking the language that they understand. They don't see you as a person. Well, then don't be acting like a person anymore. You know, I just personally, the whole they go low, we go high, I think is kind of horseshit. And I think it's really elitist and really naive. And it's coming from an extremely privileged place. And so, Scorio, I'd vote for you. That's what I'm saying. Anyone would. Scorio the Flame Vault. Sorry, Dan has been commenting, thinking of water. This is some Buddhist meditation technique. Yeah, that's true. Yummy grubs. Ew. Gandhi and who else? I was thinking Martin Luther King Jr. But again, he's fucking killed. He was assassinated. And it was still a slow crawl to get some of the things in place that he was demanding. And we're still working on it, So, yeah, I just think nonviolent action isn't it. I think it's something that we have been tricked over the past, few decades into thinking we should engage with because we're past all that now. And it's like, no, we're still being oppressed in the ways that we were 100 years ago in a lot of ways. Why do we have to update our resistance when they aren't updating their manner of oppression? I don't feel the need. Let them update. All right. Dan says he handed the violence off to Malcolm X and the Black Panthers, in my humble opinion. The thing is, the Black Panthers were not really violent. They just weren't. This is a whole other story. But I have done a lot of reading and watching of various, what do you call them? Oh my God, you guys. I keep wanting to say dioramas. Documentaries. Jesus Christ. And a lot of stuff that got pinned on the Black Panthers is not looking super credible. And they were, a lot of what they did was pure, community support. And they got really vilified in a way that when you actually find out what they were up to most of the time is actually, if it weren't so insidious and effective, it would be funny. But they were just doing food programs for kids in school, and cops came and pissed on the food for the children that they were feeding in the neighborhood. They literally urinated all over the food that they had prepared and collected for children. And, then they get painted as this sort of really leftist group. And it's they literally wanted children to have food to eat. How is that even a question? Don't get me started. Black Panthers, though, the marketing against them has been frighteningly effective, and they were doing a lot of good, and it's just a shame. So anyway, I'm going to wrap, but I appreciate you all so much. Thank you. And thank you, Dan, for commissioning this. Thank you, Phil, if you're listening, for writing it. I'm having a great time. Until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.